My name is Ryan New. I'm the Instructional Lead for Social Studies at Jefferson County Public Schools. Today we're going to be looking at the question, how do I shift to inquiry-based learning? The first thing to note is that oftentimes inquiry is misinterpreted as what we see on the far right, which is free inquiry. And the idea is that we would just provide questions or maybe just allow the students to come up with their own questions and just sort of throw them into the deep end. As we're going to find out, this is very dangerous because the students in the classroom, just like the swimmers in the pool, may not have the skills to be able to do this. That it's ultimately our goal is to get them to the deep end, but that it takes some time to get them accustomed to the types of processes that exist inside of inquiry. So what we can see then is essentially a very structured and controlled inquiry on the left, and as you move along and the students start to develop skills based on how you scaffold them, then students will be better ready to jump into the deep end. So why is inquiry important for our students? Young people learn by framing their own questions with or without adult help. Young people also construct their own problem-solving strategies, again with or without the help of adult assistance. You guys know this. Anyone who's ever worked with students know this. The issue is those questions and problem-solving strategies and the conclusions that young people can reach remain naive, ill-structured, undisciplined, and misleading without the intervention of adults. Just in the same way that we can't just throw our kiddos into the deep end of a pool, so too can we not just throw an inquiry at them and expect them to be successful. But inquiry is very important as well for our classrooms, right? It is entirely possible that the inquiry method will help students to produce answers their teachers crave and remember them longer, and even utter them faster. But anticipating this, you are imagining the most inconsequential part of the story. The inquiry method is not designed to do better what old environments try to do. It works you over in entirely different ways. It activates different senses, attitudes, and perceptions. It generates a different, bolder, and more potent kind of intelligence. Thus, it will cause teachers and their tests and their grading systems and their curriculums to change. It will cause everything about education to change. This was written in 1969 as an indication of how little things have changed over the last few decades. But that's going to be essential, as we've already seen, in order to transform students to be able to do things on their own and reason and think in ways that we know they can, but have never really been offered the space to do so. Why then is it important inquiry for our democracy? This brings us to the principal advantage of inquiry. It gives us something to talk about. The kind of pluralistic democracy we envision depends on deliberation among equals and pursuit of shared knowledge and understanding. Without inquiry, this kind of communication is likely to take place, but the sources of knowledge and the beliefs are either hidden or in question. However, inquiry makes the process of knowledge construction more transparent. By laying out questions, evidence, and conclusions in clear view, inquiry allows ideas to be challenged without attacking anyone's identity or belief system. Inquiry then provides us for a way of understanding in a better way the world around us. It allows us to sort of transform how our classrooms operate. And through that transformation of both individual and classroom, our classrooms can become much more democratic in their understanding. Which leads us then to the foundation of the biggest shift when it comes to the Kentucky Academic Standards for Social Studies. As you know, inquiry make up half the story. That questioning using evidence and communicating conclusions are ultimately the process to investigate the disciplinary standards of civics, economics, geography, and history. We see its importance, not only in the process of learning, but also in where it lies in the assessment. And that we recommend that the inquiry elements and the process of how to think about the world, how to investigate the world, is really predicated upon these essential standards: questioning, using evidence, and communicating conclusions. And we can see the flow of inquiry, the way that things begin, the way that it mirrors our own thinking and thoughts about the world. We begin with a question, we investigate through a myriad of lenses, we gather sources, we use those sources to produce evidence, right, on how we think about a thing, and we communicate our thinking to a much broader field. As we've said before, we're breaking down these types of questions using evidence and communicating conclusions into its bare essentials. As you've probably noticed in a lot of our frameworks, we color code everything. Red is always questions, yellow is always sources, and blue is always some type of task. Because ultimately, question, sources, and task allow us to simplify what's going on in the standards into a tangible product in the classroom. We have to understand then how questions, sources, and task work together in a cyclical form around the disciplinary standards to make sense of what's going on. Sources and questions work together because sources can spark curiosity. They also are going to deliver disciplinary content, and they help answer the questions through argument. Task and sources work together, right? Task helps students organize their thinking around sources and the conversations that are had on the source's behalf. And ultimately, task and questions work together because they are the tasks that are geared to help answer and organize the question for the students. Questions, sources, and tasks then become the essential elements of inquiry. When it comes to question, the standards talk about two different types. It may be the case that in your class you've talked about focus questions or essential questions. We're not here to squabble about those kind of ideas. We're saying that if the test is going to use the language of the standards, that it might be in your best interest and your students' best interest to talk deeply about the difference between compelling and supporting questions. Compelling questions are much larger. They are intellectually rigorous. They are student-friendly. They are argumentative, meaning that compelling questions have some intellectual understanding to them that are grounded in the real world, but they're presented in a way that is much more friendly so that students can not only hold them in their heads, hold the question in their heads, but also to allow students to make sense of the world around them. That compelling questions actually provide space for students' understanding. So for example, if we were to look at a question like, how does where you live affect how you live? Students have some experience in their everyday world that might help inform what's going on. But if we were to couple that question with a world history course that's looking at Atlantic trade or Indian Ocean trade at the time, we can see then that a question like that is more of an umbrella understanding that makes sense of how the student understands that question in their day-to-day life, but also how that question would have been seen historically. For us, the compelling questions help frame units. They are divergent in their understanding. There can be multiple answers to a compelling question, so long as students are able to, in the creation of arguments, back up their ideas and claims with evidence. Compelling questions then are motivating students to try to move in one direction or another because they are interesting, which makes then compelling questions very difficult to make. How do you make space for student interest, but also be able to cover content and standards? These are the jobs of compelling questions. When it comes to supporting questions are much more grounded in the knowns of the discipline. They are embodying the disciplinary standards. And in our frameworks, as you'll see later on, we've aligned disciplinary standards to the supporting questions. Supporting questions then frame our lessons and are the means to which we can actually scaffold student understanding to be able to get to the compelling question. Every day then, every unit, and the entire year is predicated around the idea that framing questions allow us to investigate both the past and the contemporary world in more interesting ways. But students don't get to just answer however they please. Sources play, specifically primary and secondary, a vital role in understanding what the answers are going to be to those questions. So what then makes up a source? For us, a source is any material of human or natural activities that can be studied or analyzed. Essentially, anything that exists can be a source. Oftentimes when selecting sources, we have to figure out what are the different perspectives. What are the different types of sources that we might use with our students? And when it comes to the complexity of sources, how will we make those sources accessible to all of our students? And we can do this through excerpting, annotating, and modifying. We have another video coming up that talks much more about how do you gather, select, and adapt sources for student access. Finally, we look at tasks. For us in Jefferson County, we have 4 major tasks. We have argument, action, organizational, and discussion. As we've mentioned many times, argument and action tasks are the ultimate goals of social studies. That by creating arguments, our students are much more informed about the types of actions they can take in their classroom, schools, and community. When it comes to organizational discussion tasks, these are largely ways that students can collaborate, working together to try to figure out how to construct arguments and how to take action. That once again, the inquiry process should never be done alone. If we turn very quickly then, we can see the type of language being used in the standards. We can identify in the questioning standards above, compelling questions, supporting questions. And the using evidence, we can look at, well, evidence, primary and secondary sources, perspectives. And finally, communicating conclusions, we can see the idea of explanations, reasoning, correct sequence, the idea of relevant information and data, diverse perspectives, creating arguments using claims and evidence from multiple sources. And then ultimately, different ways of approaching problems throughout history, both then and now, and how that we could use a range of deliberative and democratic procedures in order to address a current issue through some sort of discussion or action. So we can sort of see here that the 4 major tasks are embodied inside the standards, as are the need for sources and for questions. The same can be said for middle school. We see questions at the top. We see the differentiation between supporting and compelling questions and how to use each of them to our own purposes. We see once again the idea of multiple sources, claims and now counterclaims. We see the idea of making sure that we understand how to gather relevant information from multiple sources, being able to look at the origin, authority, structure, context, and corroborative value of those sources. And then ultimately, just as we've seen before, the goal is to create explanations that are well reasoned and evidenced, to construct arguments based upon different multiple disciplines and perspectives. And then ultimately we want to address how do we take care of problems both in today and how do we study those in the past to take care of their problems there too. The same is also true for high school, that we want to try to find what's going on with the questions. How are we using sources and evidence? And ultimately, how are we trying to work together in a deliberative model or in an action model in order to take care of that argument and action inside of, again, classrooms, schools, and communities? What might inquiry look like in a typical class? So we've talked very broadly about these major ideas of questions, sources, and tasks. But what would they might look like inside of a lesson? Imagine in the beginning of the lesson is that you engage the question immediately. That for us in Jefferson County, the learning target is the supporting question. It has been aligned to disciplinary standards. It is exactly what focuses the learning, not just on that day, but how it helps students answer a compelling question. That engaging the question, we can do so through sources. You could use a source to spark curiosity or to help frame and contextualize a supporting question. And then ultimately students are discussing right at the beginning of the class what that question might be. In the middle of the lesson, we're really talking about engaging sources through discussion. In order to help answer those questions, we've got to look and read a bunch of sources, which are difficult for our students to be able to do. That's why we want them to collaborate, which is a scaffold that helps them through discussion task complete organizers that are making sense of the discussions, the sources, and the questions that students are engaging in. These organizational tasks can be as simple as Venn diagrams or annotations of maps, or even a webbing that the students create collectively. So that ultimately, students are able to focus their learning on a supporting question, use sources and discussions, as a way to organize their ideas in organizational tasks, to communicate conclusions by the end of the lesson by creating some form of argument task, which is really about claims, explanations, generalizations, and descriptions. Then, even after the argument has been made, we can still look at how we've reflected on those arguments through discussion tasks. As we've seen before, the C3 framework provides an excellent foundation for moving through not just a year, not just a unit, but also a lesson of trying to look at what is the question, how do we understand that question through different disciplines, how do we use the evidence from those disciplines to create argument and action. And then ultimately, the inquiry process plays the predominant role in being able to link the thinking that students do to the products that are produced through argument and action. In this session then, we really looked at how do I shift towards inquiry-based learning. Thank you.